Every afternoon, sometime around 4:30, a German shepherd entered Prairie Haven Veterans Memorial Cemetery and carried away one white rose. He passed discarded food without slowing. He ignored the trash near the maintenance building and never disturbed the other memorials. One flower, always one. After 21 roses disappeared in 3 weeks, former Navy SEAL Bennett Sloan reviewed the security footage. The dog walked directly to the arrangements, smelled the roses one by one, then chose a single white bloom with remarkable care. He held the stem gently between his teeth and left through the service gate without running or hiding. The following afternoon, Bennett waited for him. When the dog appeared, Bennett did not call out. He watched him take the rose, then followed him beyond the cemetery walls. What Bennett discovered at the end of that route would change the meaning of every missing flower. But before he could protect the quiet ritual he had uncovered, someone inside the cemetery decided it had to end. Tell us where you're watching from, and stay with us to discover where this German shepherd takes a white rose every day. 3 weeks earlier, October had settled gently over the fields outside Leavenworth, Kansas. Morning fog gathered along the lower rows of Prairie Haven Veterans Memorial Cemetery, then loosened beneath the pale sun that never seemed eager to rise very high. By noon, the bronze plaques warmed beneath the light, while dry leaves moved through the walkways in loose circles before catching against flag holders and stone borders. Bennett Sloan came to Prairie Haven every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. He arrived shortly after the maintenance crew unlocked the service building, signed the volunteer ledger, and wheeled out a narrow cart carrying soft brushes, cotton cloths, distilled water, wooden picks, and the mild cleaning solution approved for the cemetery's bronze surfaces. Nothing in his cart looked important enough to require a former Navy SEAL, but Bennett treated every hinge, plaque, and weathered line of lettering as though carelessness might cost someone more than metal. That morning, he worked along the western colonnade, where years of oxidation had darkened the names beneath a memorial dedicated to sailors lost at sea. He loosened the dirt from the recessed letters without scraping their edges, wiped the surface in slow passes, and stepped back after each section to make sure the finish remained even. 10 years at Prairie Haven had taught him patience. He knew which low corner held moisture after a foggy morning, and which flag boxes swelled when the air turned cold. He knew where the roots of an old cottonwood were beginning to raise the walkway, and which bronze panels needed inspection before winter. More quietly, he knew the habits of the people who came through the gates. The Halperns visited on the first Sunday of every month and always left 2 peppermint candies beneath their son's photograph. Mrs. Heating brought garden shears because she distrusted the ones supplied by the cemetery. A retired chief petty officer named Leonard Booth spent 20 minutes beside his brother's grave, whether the temperature was 90 degrees or 20. Families often found Bennett before they found the office. A woman stopped beside his cart that morning and asked whether a replacement nameplate had arrived for her father's memorial bench. Bennett gave her the expected date and showed her the temporary marker he had prepared so visitors would not mistake the empty mounting holes for neglect. Later, an older man approached holding a weather-darkened challenge coin. "My wife thought I lost this here last week," he said. Bennett opened the shallow drawer beneath his cart and handed him a small envelope marked with the man's surname. The man looked at the coin through the plastic window, then back at Bennett. "You remember? You said your brother carried one like it." The man closed both hands around the envelope. "Thank you, Mr. Sloan." Walter Briggs stood several yards away near the administration path. He had been directing a delivery driver toward the storage building, his gray uniform pressed neatly despite the dust along the road. 60, Walter still carried himself with the deliberate calm of someone accustomed to being obeyed without raising his voice. He knew many of the regular visitors by name. He carried folding chairs for widows, opened stubborn vehicle doors for older veterans, and kept an umbrella behind the guard desk for sudden changes in weather. When families asked how long he had worked at Prairie Haven, he usually answered with the same mild smile. 25 years. Long enough for the place to become my second home. The visitor with the coin nodded politely toward Walter before walking away, but the gratitude had already been given elsewhere. Walter adjusted the ring of keys clipped at his belt. The metal struck once against his buckle. "Sloan," he called. "You signed in this morning?" Bennett glanced toward the guard station. 7:12, Walter opened the ledger anyway, ran one finger down the page, and closed it again, just making sure. By late afternoon, Bennett moved to the memorial of the unreturned, a curved stone wall bearing the names of service members whose remains had never come home. Some had vanished at sea. Others had been lost in aircraft crashes or operations whose details survived only in sealed records and the memories of those who returned. Bennett cleaned the plaques from left to right. He worked around the name Elliot Crane. The small bronze panel did not appear neglected. Another volunteer maintained it on the weeks Bennett worked that section, following a task assignment no one remembered making. Bennett inspected the screws and checked the stone beneath it for staining, but his cloth never crossed the engraved letters. 10 years earlier, Elliot had entered their final operation beside him and had not left it. Bennett had resigned from active service months later. He offered no dramatic explanation to the men who asked, and none to the civilians who later learned what he had once done. He found contract work for a while, then warehouse supervision, followed by several jobs that ended without argument or regret. Brady Haven was the only place he kept returning to. The work did not ask him to explain the difference between surviving and coming home. It gave his hands corroded fasteners, weakened hinges, and names fading beneath mineral deposits. Those problems could be measured. Most of them could be repaired. At the 3:45, Bennett crossed the eastern section to inspect a reed stand reported as unstable. A large arrangement of white roses stood 2 rows beyond it, placed that morning beside the grave of a Navy corpsman. Something about the arrangement stopped him. He had passed it earlier while speaking with the groundskeeper. At that time, the outer ring had held an even number of roses. Now one was missing. Bennett crouched beside the vase. No petals lay on the ground. The ribbon remained tied, and the surrounding stems had not been crushed or pulled sideways. Whoever removed the rose had drawn it gently from the outer edge without disturbing the balance of the arrangement. Walter approached along the path, carrying his radio low against his hip. Problem? 1 rose is gone. Walter studied the arrangement for less than a second. Wind probably loosened it. The wind would have left the stem nearby. Then a crow took it. They carry stranger things. Bennett looked along the grass bordering the path. Nothing white moved among the leaves. Walter's radio clicked. He lifted it, listened to a maintenance request, and turned away. Don't let one flower keep you past 5, he said. The east gate closes on schedule. 2 days later, a white rose disappeared from a memorial near the chapel. The following Monday, another vanished from a family plot beside the central avenue. No vase had been overturned. No letter, metal, coin, or personal object was missing. The grass around the markers remained undisturbed, and none of the families reported seeing a stranger moving among the graves. Bennett bought a small cardboard-covered notebook from the pharmacy near his apartment. He recorded each date, the cemetery section, the condition of the arrangement, the last time the flower had been seen, and the nearest camera angle. He did not call the entries thefts. In the upper corner of each page, he wrote only, white rose. The pattern grew slowly enough to be dismissed, then quickly enough that dismissing it required effort. Some roses disappeared from new arrangements, others from flowers that had been standing for 2 or 3 days. They came from different sections, but always from areas with clear access to the narrow service lane running toward the eastern gate. None disappeared during funeral services. None were taken while families were present. By the end of the 3rd week, Bennett's notebook contained 21 entries. Walter stood behind the security desk reading the final page with his glasses low on his nose. That is enough for an incident report, he said. Repeated removal of memorial property. We still don't know who is taking them. The families will not care about the distinction. They may care whether someone is stealing arrangements or whether something else is happening. Walter closed the notebook and placed it on the desk. Flowers do not remove themselves. Bennett turned toward the bank of security monitors. Most cameras were positioned to watch entrances, roads, and administrative buildings rather than individual graves. But the eastern section appeared at the far edge of 2 overlapping views. Let's check before you call it vandalism. Walter looked at him for several seconds, then unlocked the recording archive. They moved backward through 3 weeks of footage, narrowing the time window according to Bennett's notes. Cars passed through the avenues. Familias came and went. Maintenance carts crossed the screen, and shadows lengthened over the headstones. The flowers had not been disappearing at random. They were leaving Prairie Haven according to a rhythm only someone who knew every path could have recognized. On the 21st recording, movement appeared beside the eastern walkway near the end of the afternoon. Walter paused the footage. A German shepherd entered the frame. The dog walked past a discarded lunch bag without turning his head. It crossed between the markers, stopped before one arrangement, then another, smelling the flowers without touching them. At the third vase, he selected a white rose from the outer edge. His teeth closed gently around the stem. The remaining flowers barely moved. The shepherd turned toward the service gate and walked out of view without running, hiding, or once looking back. Walter leaned closer to the monitor. "A stray has been entering the grounds." Bennett did not answer. He watched the empty edge of the screen where the dog had disappeared, thinking about the untouched food, the careful choice, and the certainty with which the animal had turned toward the gate. The German shepherd had not come to Prairie Haven searching for something. He had come knowing exactly where he needed to go. Walter replayed the footage twice before shutting down the monitor. "The dog comes back, we call County Animal Services," he said. Bennett closed his notebook and slipped it into the breast pocket of his work shirt. "We still don't know what it's doing. We know it's entering restricted grounds and removing memorial property." Bennett looked toward the dark screen where the shepherd had disappeared through the service gate. "Then I'll watch the gate." Walter's expression remained pleasant, though his fingers rested on the desk beside the incident forms. "You have restoration work scheduled." "I'll finish it before then." The following Wednesday, Bennett completed his assigned inspections earlier than usual. He repaired a loose hinge on a flag display near the chapel, documented a hairline crack beneath the western colonnade, and returned his cleaning supplies to the maintenance room before the afternoon shadows reached the service lane. He waited near the eastern gate without food, leash, or any attempt to disguise himself. The dog had already entered Prairie Haven 21 times. Hiding would only turn Bennett into a new threat along a route the animal clearly understood. The last of the warm daylight rested across the headstones when movement appeared beyond the iron fence. The German shepherd slipped through a narrow space where the bottom rail had lifted above the saw. He stopped as soon as he saw Bennett. From a few yards away, the details missing from the security footage came into view. The shepherd's coat was dark along the back and amber around the legs, dulled by dust but still dense. His ribs showed faintly when he breathed. An old scar broke the fur above his right brow, and his left rear foot reached the ground a fraction later than the others. A weathered leather collar circled his neck. The buckle was gone, leaving only a darker band in the fur where something had once rested for a long time. Bennett remained beside the path. The shepherd watched him, ears forward, body held neither low nor rigid. When Bennett stepped back and opened the lane, the dog waited another moment before moving past. It did not hurry toward the nearest flowers. A woman stood beside a grave in the first row, arranging red carnations around a framed photograph. The shepherd gave the area a wide distance, crossed behind a row of maples, and continued toward the eastern section. Bennett followed several paces behind. The dog stopped first at a vase of yellow roses and breathed in their scent without touching them. At the next memorial, he examined a mixed arrangement of lilies and chrysanthemums. Only when he reached a cluster of white roses did his posture settle. He selected a bloom from the outer edge. The stem caught beneath a silver ribbon. The shepherd pulled once, felt the resistance, and released it. He shifted his head, found a lower angle, then drew the rose free without loosening the knot or disturbing the remaining flowers. Bennett looked back at the arrangement. Even from a few feet away, the missing bloom was difficult to notice. The dog turned toward the service gate. He had ignored the occupied grave, passed several fresh arrangements, and refused to damage the one he chose from. Whatever drove the behavior, it carried more patience than panic. The shepherd slipped beneath the raised rail and entered the narrow service road outside the cemetery. Bennett stood at the gate for several seconds. Leaving early meant abandoning the final hour of his volunteer shift. Following the dog could lead to a backyard, a feeding place, or nowhere Bennett had any right to go. Yet allowing the animal to disappear again would leave Walter's description, intrusión, removal, as the only account anyone possessed. Bennett took out his phone. Leaving early for an issue connected to the East grounds, he wrote to Dana Kessler. "I'll document it when I return." He sent the message and followed. The shepherd remained about 20 yards ahead, the rose held upright between his teeth. He left the main road at the first intersection and turned south through an older neighborhood of narrow houses, detached garages, and porches built close to the sidewalk. The shortest path toward the commercial district ran east. The dog continued south. Bennett adjusted his pace but did not close the distance. Years of observation had taught him that following someone too closely changed the choices they made. Animals were no different. The route descended toward a freight crossing bordered by weeds and waist-high fencing. Warning lights began flashing before the shepherd reached the tracks. He stopped behind the painted line. A locomotive horn rolled through the neighborhood, followed by the heavy metallic rhythm of a freight train moving across the road. The first blast pressed the dog's ears back against his head. His rear leg tightened beneath him, but the rose remained in his mouth. The train was long enough for two cars to turn around and seek another crossing. Bennett stayed near a utility pole while the shepherd waited. Each time the ground trembled, the dog adjusted his stance and angled his muzzle so the stem would not scrape the pavement. He did not pace along the barrier or search for a way beneath it. He simply watched the passing cars until the final one cleared the street. Nearly 7 minutes had gone by when the gates lifted. The shepherd crossed. Beyond the tracks, he passed a laundromat with fogged windows and an antique shop displaying old clocks beneath a fading canvas awning. Between them stood a narrow flower store with buckets arranged along the front glass. The shepherd slowed beneath its green awning. For several seconds, he looked through the window. A woman inside was trimming stems behind the counter. She did not see him. The dog continued before Bennett could decide whether the pause meant anything. He stored the detail away and kept walking. 2 blocks later, the quiet route opened onto a wider street beside an elementary school. Buses waited along the curb while parents filled the pickup lane. Crossing guards moved children through the intersection in uneven groups, bright vests flashing between parked vehicles. The shepherd stopped near a low brick wall. A boy passing with 2 friends dropped a strip of turkey from his sandwich. It landed close enough for the dog to smell. His head turned, and for a moment his weight shifted toward it. Then he looked across the street. The rose stayed between his teeth. He waited until the buses began pulling away and the crossing guard raised a hand for the last group of cars. When the road cleared, he crossed at the painted lines and resumed the same steady pace. Bennett followed, noticing how little of the journey required hesitation. The dog knew where traffic gathered, where trains interrupted the road, and where the sidewalks narrowed. Even the sounds that unsettled him had already been fitted into the route. This was not the path of an animal wandering until it found shelter. It was a path remembered through repetition. The older houses gave way to a row of small duplexes and single-story homes shaded by cottonwoods. Wind moved between the buildings, lifting dry leaves from the gutters and pushing them along the sidewalk in sudden waves. A flattened paper bag caught the air ahead of the shepherd and spun across his path. He turned his head at the wrong moment. The rose slipped free. A gust caught the petals and rolled the flower toward the curb. The shepherd stepped quickly, placing one front paw across the lower stem before it reached the street. He lowered his head, took the rose again, and waited for the wind to ease. One wet petal now carried a faint crease along its edge. Bennett watched him continue. The dog was not delivering a perfect flower. It was protecting the one he had managed to bring this far. Several streets later, the houses opened around a small neighborhood park, its concrete paths curved beneath old trees, and a dry fountain stood near the entrance with leaves gathered in its empty basin. 3 benches faced the central lawn. A woman sat on the third. Throughout the journey, Bennett had believed he was following the answer to a missing flower report. Then the shepherd saw that bench, and the uneven rhythm of his steps suddenly quickened. The woman wore a blue cardigan buttoned high at the neck. Her silver hair had been gathered neatly behind her head, and a white cane rested against the bench beside her. One hand lay open on her knee. She did not turn. When the shepherd entered the park, his nails made a soft, irregular pattern against the brick path. The woman's fingers moved. Her hand rose to the exact height of his muzzle before he reached her. The shepherd stopped between her knees and placed the rose stem into her palm. She closed her fingers around it with practiced care, then brought the flower toward her face. Her thumb passed over the folded edge of the damaged petal. She smiled. Bennett remained beneath the nearest tree, far enough away that his presence did not enter the moment. The woman lowered one hand and found the shepherd's cheek. Her fingers moved behind his ear, then along the worn collar. The dog sat close to her legs and rested his head across her knee. She bent slightly toward him. "Mos," she said, "you went a long way again today." Mos lifted his head before Bennett moved from beneath the tree. The shepherd looked directly toward him, ears angled forward, yet made no effort to leave the woman's side. His body remained close to her knees, the worn leather collar partly hidden beneath the fur around his neck. The woman followed the change in his breathing. "Someone came with you," she said. Bennett stepped onto the brick path. "I'm sorry." He didn't mean to watch from a distance for that long. Her face turned toward his voice. "Most people who mean harm don't apologize before they introduce themselves. My name is Bennett Sloan. I volunteer at Prairie Haven." Her fingers remained behind Moss's ear. "The veteran cemetery." "Yes, ma'am." "Miriam Vale." Bennett stopped a few feet from the bench. He told her about the missing roses, the notebook he had kept, and the security footage showing Moss entering the grounds. He explained that he had followed the dog because the cemetery guard was preparing to report the matter as repeated removal of memorial property. Miriam listened without interrupting. When Bennett finished, she lowered the rose into her lap. "Did he damage anyone's grave?" It was not the question Bennett had expected. "No, he never stepped on a marker, knocked over a vase, or took more than one flower. Today he waited until a woman finished visiting before he went near that section." Miriam's hand relaxed around the stem. "Then Edwin taught him better than I realized." Bennett glanced at Moss. "Edwin was your husband." "He was." The answer settled between them before she added, "He died 3 weeks ago." Moss shifted closer until one of his paws rested against her shoe. Miriam traced the damaged edge of the white petal with her thumb. Edwin Dale had spent most of his life repairing watches, surveyor's instruments, and small mechanical gauges in a narrow shop near the freight tracks. He had the patience to sit beneath a magnifying lamp for an hour while fitting a spring no wider than a fingernail, but could lose his glasses while they were still resting on top of his head. Broken things never offended him, Miriam said. He only wanted to know whether they had stopped working or whether someone had stopped trying. Moss began appearing behind Edwin's shop the previous winter. First he stayed near the dumpsters. After closing time, Edwin left water in a steel bowl and food beneath the rear awning, then returned inside without waiting for the dog to approach. For nearly 2 weeks, the bowls were empty by morning, but Edwin never saw Moss eat. The first time the shepherd remained while Edwin locked the back door, he kept 6 feet between them all the way to the corner. A few days later, he followed Edwin across the freight tracks. He never entered the Vale house, even when Edwin held the door open, but sometimes slept beneath the small roof above the kitchen steps. "And the roses?" Bennett asked. Miriam smiled faintly. "Those came long before Moss. When they were younger, Edwin had often worked later than promised. Miriam would walk to the park rather than wait inside, and he would bring one white rose as an apology. After enough years, the apology became a habit, then something neither of them needed to explain. Even after Miriam's sight began failing, Edwin continued meeting her at the third bench. He could have brought the flower home. She could have waited inside. Neither suggested changing the arrangement. So many rituals survived because changing them would have required admitting how much they mattered. Miriam did not need anyone to lead her to the park. The route began at the blue gate outside her house and followed a metal fence long enough for her cane to pass 63 vertical bars. She recognized the first lamppost by the wider concrete around its base and the second by a shallow crack beneath it. When the smooth sidewalk became brick, she turned toward the trees. "I walked that road before I needed the cane," she said. "My feet remember more of it than my eyes ever did." After Edwin's funeral, Miriam went to the bench at the usual time. She had not decided to wait for him. The hour arrived, and she found herself fastening her cardigan and reaching for the cane. Moss came the following afternoon carrying a white rose. Miriam had assumed Edwin once trained him to fetch flowers from the shop. She did not know the roses came from Prairie Haven until Bennett told her. "Perhaps he began there because Edwin's funeral was there," she said. "Was your husband buried at Prairie Haven?" "Our son is." Bennett did not ask the next question while they were still in the park. The light was fading, and the afternoon warmth had already left the brick beneath their feet. Bennett offered to walk with Miriam as far as her house. She reached for her cane. You may walk beside me. You know the way. I figured you did. He stayed along the outside edge of the sidewalk, describing only what had changed since she traveled the route earlier: a bicycle left across part of the path, a trash container rolled too far from a driveway, and a child's chalk drawing that would not interfere with her cane. Moss moved between them, sometimes several paces ahead, then returning to Miriam whenever passing traffic grew louder. The blue gate stood 3 houses beyond the park. Inside, Miriam's home carried the quiet order of 2 people whose possessions had occupied the same places for many years. 2 ceramic mugs faced one another on the kitchen table. A small bowl beside the door held Edwin's keys, a folded handkerchief, and 3 loose watch batteries. On the living room shelf rested a triangular display case containing a folded American flag. Beneath it stood a photograph of a young sailor in dress blues. His smile leaned slightly to one side, as though someone behind the camera had made him laugh before the shutter closed. The nameplate below the frame read, Petty Officer, 2nd Class, United States Navy. A small ceramic vase stood beside the photograph, filled with dried white roses. Miriam heard Bennett stop. Our son, she said. 3 years ago. Bennett looked at the folded flag, then at the 2 mugs in the kitchen. After Owen died, Edwin took over the tasks Miriam's declining sight had made harder. He read official letters aloud, arranged medication by the day, and marked food containers with raised labels. He never moved furniture without telling her, and never answered a question addressed to her. They preserved Owen's place in the house through ordinary habits. Edwin still listened to the baseball games Owen had followed. Miriam made the same cinnamon bread on his birthday. They kept the porch light on every November evening when his ship had once been expected home. If we changed too much, Miriam said, we were afraid the house would forget his voice. After Edwin died, Miriam lost more than the man who helped her navigate printed words and prescription bottles. She lost the last person who remembered Owen as a boy afraid of thunder, a teenager who left wet towels on the bathroom floor, and a sailor who called home whenever he could find a quiet corner aboard ship. Mostly beside the dried roses. Bennett remained standing until Miriam pointed toward an empty chair. You may sit down, Mr. Sloan. Grief is not improved by making guests stand. A short laugh escaped him before he could prevent it. The next morning, Bennett returned to the flower shop. The woman behind the counter recognized Edwin's name immediately. She did not know about Miriam's blindness, Owen, or the roses taken from Prairie Haven. She knew only what she had seen through the shop window. Edwin bought 1 white rose near the end of most afternoons. Moss waited beneath the awning and followed him when he left. On days Edwin's knees troubled him, the distance between the man and the dog shortened because both of them walked more slowly. After Edwin's death, Moss disappeared for several days. Then he began passing the shop alone. The woman looked toward the buckets near the front window. I thought he was waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. Bennett left without correcting her. At Prairie Haven, he found Walter inside the guard office sorting visitor permits. Bennett explained what he had learned and proposed a simple arrangement: 1 white rose placed near the service gate, no access during burials, and observation during the late afternoon route. Bennett would take responsibility whenever he was on the grounds. Walter listened with both hands folded over the permits. Bennett told him about Edwin, Miriam, and Owen. He did not ask the cemetery to approve a stray dog roaming freely. He asked only that they avoid ending the ritual before finding a safer way to continue it. Walter leaned back in his chair. You understand the dog better than I do, he said. Let him do what he needs to do. Bennett studied his face, found no open resistance, and nodded. As he reached the door, Walter spoke again. You working tomorrow? No, I'm back Friday. Thursday. Not scheduled. Walter gave a small nod and returned to the permits. Bennett left Prairie Haven believing that a modest agreement had been kept. Being the guard office window, Walter opened the volunteer schedule and studied the 2 days Bennett would not be there. He began his report without claiming that Moss had attacked anyone or damaged a grave. He wrote, repeated unauthorized entry, removal of memorial items, unidentified animal with no confirmed owner, possible safety risk to elderly visitors, unable to guarantee control. Dana Kessler read the document between a damaged irrigation line, a delayed military burial, and 3 calls from families disputing the cemetery's decoration rules. Walter reminded her of an incident 8 years earlier, when an unleashed dog startled an older visitor and caused her to fall near the chapel steps. The incident had resulted in a broken wrist, a formal complaint, and a written warning placed in Walter's personnel file. Dana read the report once more. "If it comes back, call County Animal Services," she said. "They can scan it for a chip and determine whether someone owns it." Walter thanked her. He did not call Bennett. The following afternoon, he stood near the eastern section as the shadows lengthened across the service lane. When Moss appeared beneath the gate and began walking toward the white roses, Walter reached for his radio. 2 days later, Bennett stopped at the flower shop before driving to Prairie Haven. The woman behind the counter recognized him from his earlier visit. She did not ask why he wanted a single white rose. She chose one with a straight stem, wrapped the lower half in plain paper, and trimmed the end before handing it across the counter. "Edwin always checked the petals first," she said. "Then the stem." Bennett looked down at the flower. "Did he ever say why white?" "No. Some habits get old enough that people stop asking." He paid and left. By the time Bennett reached Prairie Haven, the morning haze had burned away, leaving a thin blue sky crossed by slow-moving clouds. He signed the volunteer ledger, loaded his cart, and worked through the eastern section without mentioning the rose tucked inside a narrow water tube. A little before the light began to soften, he carried it to the service gate. He placed the flower just inside the lifted rail, where Moss could see it without walking among the graves. The white petals stood above the dry grass, bright against the rust-colored leaves gathered along the fence. Bennett returned to a bronze marker 20 yards away and continued loosening dirt from the engraved letters. He heard the grounds crew before he saw them. Their mower trailer rattled past the maintenance building, then turned toward the exit as the last 2 workers waved through the windshield. A family near the Central Avenue folded 3 canvas chairs and carried them back to a station wagon, leaving a small flag beside the grave they had visited. The shadow of the main flagpole stretched farther across the walkway. The rose remained where Bennett had placed it. He cleaned another line of lettering, rinsed the cloth, and looked toward the gate. Nothing moved beneath the rail. Wind pressed against the paper wrapping around the stem and made it whisper against the grass. Bennett removed his work gloves, then put them on again when the air cooled enough to settle into his hands. A maintenance cart crossed the far lane and disappeared behind the administration building. The chapel doors closed. Somewhere near the western wall, a metal flag holder tapped twice against stone. Most did not come. Bennett wheeled his cart closer to the service road and waited without pretending to work. The white rose had begun to lean toward the fence, though the stem was still firm. Nearly an hour after he had set it down, he picked it up. Walter was inside the guard office finishing an entry in the visitor log. He glanced at Bennett, then at the flower. "Did the shepherd come through here while I was gone?" Bennett asked. "Not that I saw." "Wednesday or Thursday?" Walter closed the logbook. "Strays change their routes. Someone may have started feeding him somewhere else." Bennett had not finished asking whether any staff member had reported seeing Moss. Walter looked toward the parking lot instead of the rose. "Could have moved on," he added. "Dogs do." Bennett held his gaze for a moment, then turned toward the door. "You leaving your cart?" "I'll bring it in later." He drove directly to the neighborhood park. The third bench was partly shaded when he arrived. Miriam Bale sat in the same place as before, her cane resting beside her and one hand open on her knee. She did not turn toward the sound of Bennett's steps immediately. Her head remained angled toward the brick path leading from the street. No uneven rhythm of claws moved beneath the trees. No animal stopped before the bench and breathed against her fingers. The open hand on her knee had not changed position. When Bennett came closer, Miriam spoke. "Is he walking slower today?" Bennett stopped beside the bench. "He didn't come to the cemetery." Her fingers curled slightly, then opened again. Bennett sat at the opposite end and removed the paper from the rose. He guided the stem toward her hand, only after letting it touch the back of her fingers. Miriam accepted it. Her thumb found the clean edge of one petal, then moved down the stem. She knew before Bennett spoke that the flower had not arrived in Moss's mouth. "I bought it from Edwin's shop," he said. She held the rose across both palms. For several seconds, the only sounds came from a basketball bouncing on the far side of the park and the dry leaves shifting beneath the benches. I thought at least this would remain, Miriam said. Bennett looked toward the entrance Moss had used 2 days earlier. I'll find him. She did not ask whether he was certain. She lowered the rose into her lap and waited until Bennett stood before reaching for her cane. They took the familiar route toward the blue gate. Bennett stayed along the curbside, calling out a delivery box left near the fence and a garden hose stretched across one driveway. Miriam walked at her usual pace, but the sound of her cane came closer together than before. At the second lamppost, Bennett remembered Walter asking whether he would be at Prairie Haven on both days. By the time the sidewalk changed to brick, he remembered the rest. Walter and Dana were the only people who knew the route had become predictable. Walter had answered before Bennett finished asking about the previous 2 afternoons. Every municipal or county vehicle entering the service road had to be recorded at the gate. Bennett waited until Miriam had unlocked the blue gate. I'll call when I know where he is. She touched the rose to her face and nodded once. Bennett did not return to the guard office or search through Walter's desk. He remained beside his truck and called Dana Kessler. I need you to check the service log, he said. Did County Animal Services enter Prairie Haven while I was away? Dana was silent long enough for Bennett to hear pages turning. Yesterday, she said. Late afternoon. Who signed them in? Anoter pause. Walter. Bennett did not need a longer investigation. Walter's signature already sat beneath the hour Moss usually appeared. Dana asked Bennett to meet her in the administration office. Walter arrived carrying the same logbook. Dana placed it open on the table, her finger resting beside the entry for the county vehicle. Walter read the line without changing expression. You told me you hadn't seen him, Bennett said. I said not today. You knew what I was asking. Walter removed his glasses and folded them carefully. The dog had no owner, no identification, and unrestricted access to memorial grounds. We cannot allow animals to wander through burial services and take property from graves. He avoided services until the day he doesn't. Walter's voice remained low. That restraint made the words harder rather than softer. Families expect this place to be protected, he continued. They should not have to wonder whether the flowers they leave will still be here when they return. Bennett nodded once. Those concerns are real. Walter seemed briefly surprised by the agreement. You had other choices, Bennett said. You could have told Dana the whole situation. We could have placed a rose by the gate. You could have contacted a rescue group and explained where he went every afternoon. You could have waited 2 days and worked out a controlled route. I followed procedure. You shaped the procedure before anyone else saw the facts. Walter turned toward Dana. Nothing in my report was false. Dana pulled the printed document from a folder. Her eyes passed over the phrases Walter had chosen: repeated unauthorized entry, removal of memorial items, possible risk to elderly visitors, animal of unknown ownership, unable to guarantee control. Walter put his glasses back on. 8 years ago, a loose dog knocked a woman down near the chapel. She broke her wrist. Her family blamed us, and they were right. He will not allow that to happen again because a volunteer feels attached to a stray. Bennett did not raise his voice. Miriam lost her son in the Navy 3 years ago. Her husband died 3 weeks back. That dog is carrying the last habit Edwin left behind. Walter shifted his weight. That does not change the rules. We keep places like this because the people buried here matter to someone. If protecting order causes more pain to the people they left behind, then we've forgotten what we were protecting in the first place. The office remained quiet. A printer in the adjoining room started, fed out 1 page, then stopped. Walter rested his hand on the key ring at his belt. The report did not contain a single lie. Procedure did not require you to call it vandalism, Bennett said. You chose that word. Walter's thumb stopped against one of the keys. For the first time Bennett had known him, the ring made no sound. Dana closed the folder. I approved this without asking enough questions, she said. That part is mine. Walter looked toward the window. He did not apologize. Dana turned back to Bennett. County Animal Services scanned the dog this morning. There was no chip, and no one has claimed him. Is still there. Bennett picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Which facility? Dana gave him the address. It was through the office door before Walter moved his hand from the silent keys. Bennett reached County Animal Services before the public entrance closed. The facility occupied a low concrete building near the county maintenance yard, where white service trucks stood behind chain-link fencing and the air carried the overlapping sounds of barking dogs, ringing phones, and metal doors opening farther down the hall. Two employees moved between the front desk and the intake rooms, while another spoke with a family holding a cardboard pet carrier. Nothing about the place suggested cruelty. It suggested too many animals and too few hands. A woman in navy scrubs looked up from the computer. Her badge read Renee Wickham. You're asking about the German Shepherd brought in from Prairie Haven? Yes. Are you the owner? No, I'm the person who knows why he was there. Renee studied him briefly, then asked for identification. Bennett gave her his driver's license and waited while she checked the intake file. The report described repeated entry onto memorial grounds and removal of property, she said. Animal control found him near the east section. A allowed the officer to secure him without a struggle. Was he hurt? The veterinarian checked the rear leg. It's an older injury, probably healed without proper treatment. There's no fresh damage, and he's putting weight on it. She returned Bennett's license. You can see him, but you can't take him today. I understand. Renee led him through a secure door into a corridor lined with metal kennels. Several dogs came to the front as they passed. Others remained on blankets or watched from beneath raised beds. Water bowls had been filled, and printed cards outside each enclosure listed intake dates, feeding notes, and medical observations. Moss was near the end of the row. He lay facing the back wall, his body curved around his rear leg. The old collar had been removed and placed in a clear property bag hanging beside the kennel card. Renee stopped several feet away. He eats after the room settles down. It's wary when people reach over him, but he hasn't snapped or lunged. Bennett approached the gate without crouching over it. Moss. Wanair turned toward his voice. The shepherd remained facing the wall. Bennett took the white rose from inside his jacket. It was the same flower Miriam had held in the park, returned to him before he left her house because, she said, Moss should be the next one to touch it. He placed it on the floor outside the kennel. Moss lifted his head. For several seconds, he watched the flower through the metal grid. Then he rose, crossed the enclosure, and lowered his muzzle toward the petals. His breathing moved them slightly against the concrete. He smelled the rose for a long time. When he finally raised his head, he looked past Bennett toward the far end of the corridor, where every opening door led only to another part of the building. Renee stood quietly behind him. He knows where it belongs, Bennett said. She glanced at the flower. Then put that in the information you leave with us. Back at the front desk, Renee explained the process. Moss had no microchip and carried no identification. The county had posted his description and would hold him for the required period while waiting for an owner to come forward. If no one claimed him, Bennett could apply to adopt. The application required proof that animals were permitted at his residence, contact information for a veterinary clinic, and an agreement to complete vaccinations, microchipping, and a basic behavior assessment. Bennett read every page. Renee tapped the incident report attached to the file. I also need to be direct. This is the history we received with him. I don't need you to ignore the process, Bennett said. I need that report not to be the only thing known about him. It described the white roses, the route to the third bench, and the way Moss avoided visitors and burial services. He gave Renee Miriam's name but asked that no one contact her without speaking to him first. Then he wrote down the flower shop's number and Dana's office line so the account could be verified. Renee added a sheet to the file rather than altering the original report. Now both accounts stay with him, she said. Bennett completed the application that afternoon. The following morning, he sent confirmation from his landlord and scheduled an appointment with a veterinary clinic near his apartment. He returned to the shelter during visiting hours but did not ask employees to take Moss from the kennel simply to prove the dog remembered him. He sat outside the gate while Moss ate. On the second visit, the shepherd lay with his side against the metal grid. Bennett rested one hand on the floor several inches away. After a while, Moss shifted until the fur along his shoulder touched the other side. No owner called. When the required hold ended, Moss completed the medical work and behavior screening without incident. It remained cautious around sudden movement, tolerated a leash, and responded to pressure by stepping away rather than challenging it. Renee reviewed the final paperwork with Bennett, attached the microchip information, and handed him the worn collar in its clear bag. "We fitted him with a new one," she said. "You can keep the old collar if it matters." "It might." An employee brought Moss through the side door on a blue leash. The shepherd did not leap toward Bennett. He stopped beneath the awning, smelled the cold air, and looked across the parking lot as though checking for a familiar street. Then he walked beside Bennett to the truck, occasionally glancing at the white rose resting across the passenger seat. Bennett opened the rear door and waited. Moss climbed in without assistance. The road toward Bennett's apartment turned west at the next intersection. It continued north. When Prairie Haven's gates came into view, Moss rose on the back seat, and the direction of his gaze made clear which unfinished journey had to come before any new home. Bennett parked outside the service entrance. Walter's vehicle stood near the guard office, but Bennett saw no reason to begin another conversation. He carried the rose to the raised section beneath the gate and laid it where Moss could reach it without entering the burial rose. Then he opened the truck door. Moss stepped down, smelled the ground, and found the flower. He lifted it by the stem. For a moment he stood facing Prairie Haven. The late afternoon light crossed the rows of markers, and wind moved through the small flags near the central path. Moss turned away from the graves and started toward the old neighborhood. Bennett followed at the distance the dog already understood. The freight crossing remained open. The flower shop was closing when Moss passed, and the woman inside stopped with one hand against the glass. At the school intersection, the buses had already gone, leaving only a crossing guard folding her yellow vest beside the curb. Moss followed every turn. At the park, Miriam sat on the third bench with her cane beside her, both hands resting in her lap. The uneven rhythm of Moss's steps reached the brick path. Miriam's head lifted. Her right hand moved a few inches, then stopped. She kept it close to her body, as though the sound might belong to memory and reaching too soon could send it away. Moss slowed before the bench. He approached without releasing the rose and pressed the side of his head into her waiting palm. Miriam's fingers closed in the fur below his ear. Only then did Moss lower his muzzle and place the flower across her knees. She bent forward until her forehead rested against his head. Her cane slipped against the bench, and Bennett caught it before it reached the ground. No one said Moss had returned. The familiar sound of Miriam's hand moving along his collar was enough. That evening, Moss entered Bennett's apartment but remained near the back door. Bennett placed a folded blanket beside the wall, set down food and water, and left the rooms open without calling the dog farther inside. Moss slept beside the door. The next morning, Bennett found him standing near the kitchen table. A fresh white rose lay beside Bennett's keys, still wrapped from the flower shop. Moss looked from the flower to the door. After breakfast, Bennett said. On Bennett's work days, Moss rode with him to Prairie Haven and waited near the maintenance building until the late afternoon. On other days, Bennett still drove him to the service gate before the light changed over the headstones. The route to the third bench became part of both their schedules. Bennett also began stopping at Miriam's house once or twice a week. During one visit, she asked him to look at Edwin's tabletop radio, which had begun losing power whenever the cord shifted. Bennett cleaned the contact and secured the loose connection without changing the position of the controls. On another afternoon, Miriam brought out her telephone and asked whether Edwin's final voicemail could be saved somewhere easier to reach. Bennett copied it onto a simple recorder with one large playback button, then let her decide where it belonged. Later, she asked him to place raised markers beside two settings on the thermostat. Here and here, she instructed, guiding his finger. Do not mark the others. You know where those are. He followed her directions. They rarely discussed Elliot, Edwin, or Owen at length. Miriam made coffee. Bennett used the chipped green mug she kept above the stove, and Edwin's blue cup remained on its hook. Some afternoons the radio played quietly while Moss slept beneath the table. Bennett and Miriam let the spaces between songs remain empty. Neither of them hurried to fill them. Walter did not interfere with Moss again. He also did not approach him. When Bennett arrived at Prairie Haven with the shepherd in the truck, Walter usually remained inside the guard office until they had passed. If their paths crossed near the administration building, he offered a brief nod and continued whatever task was in his hands. Dana had approved a controlled arrangement, not unrestricted access. Moss stayed on a leash in the parking area and along the public walkways. Near the eastern service gate, Bennett placed a white rose outside the burial rose and unclipped the lead only after Moss had entered the agreed route leading away from the cemetery. The distinction mattered. Families could visit without an unfamiliar dog approaching them. Burial services remained undisturbed, and Moss no longer needed to take flowers from memorial arrangements. For nearly 2 weeks, the system worked without complaint. One late afternoon, Prairie Haven hosted a small memorial gathering for a former Army mechanic. Folding chairs had been returned to storage, and most of the visitors had left before 2 men arrived in a dented pickup. They were old friends of the deceased, according to the names they gave Walter. Both had been drinking. One carried a paper bag folded tightly around the neck of a bottle. They walked to the grave and found that several decorations had been removed from the marker, a glass container, a metal sign driven too close to the mowing line, and a string of battery lights wrapped around the flag holder. Cemetery staff had placed the items in a labeled storage bin for the family to collect. Walter explained the policy and offered to show them where the decorations had been stored. The taller man stepped closer. "You had no right to touch any of it." "Nothing was discarded," Walter said. "The family can speak with the manager during office hours." "We came during visiting hours. The office is closed. Come back tomorrow, and Miss Kessler will review it with you." The other men kicked the base of the flag stand. It tipped across the grass, scattering 2 small flags beside the marker. Walter bent to retrieve them. The taller man caught his shoulder and shoved him backward. Walter's heel struck the edge of a stone step. Near the eastern gate, Bennett had just removed Moss's leash and reached for the rose inside his work cart. The shepherds had turned at the sharp scrape of Walter's shoe. Then he ran. Moss crossed the service lane and placed himself between Walter and the 2 men. It did not strike either of them, his paws planted wide against the pavement, his body upright, a series of hard barks filling the space beneath the administration awning. Walter caught the metal railing before he fell. The man nearest Moss stepped back. His friend raised one hand toward Walter, perhaps to point, perhaps to reach past the dog. Moss moved forward half a pace. It did not close the remaining distance. "Enough!" Bennett called. The raised hand dropped. Both men retreated toward their truck, still shouting but no longer advancing. "Moss, here." The shepherd backed away from Walter and returned to Bennett. His barking stopped before he reached him. Bennett clipped the leash to his collar and kept one hand low on the lead. Moss stood beside his leg, watching the truck leave through the main gate. Dana called the Leavenworth County Sheriff's Office and saved the camera footage. The fallen flag stand was set upright, the scattered flags returned to the grave, and Walter declined the paramedic evaluation offered over the phone. He sat in the guard office afterward with both hands around a paper cup of water. The dog Walter had described as impossible to control had used less force than the men standing in front of him. Moss had kept Walter from falling, but the part that followed him home was quieter. The shepherd had stopped the instant no one needed protection anymore. 3 days later, Walter walked to the neighborhood park alone. Miriam sat on the third bench with Moss resting near her shoes. Bennett was not there. The afternoon was clear and cool, and music from the repaired radio drifted faintly through the open window of the blue-gated house. Walter carried one white rose. Moss noticed him first. The shepherd lifted his head but remained beside Miriam. She turned toward the sound of Walter's shoes on the brick. "MRS. Vale. Yes. My name is Walter Briggs. I work security at Prairie Haven." Miriam's hand moved down to Moss's neck. Walter stood several feet from the bench. "I'm the one who called Animal Services." She said nothing. "I wrote the report they used. Mr. Sloan had asked me to wait, and I told him I would." Walter looked at the rose in his hand. "I did it after learning when he would be away." Miriam's fingers moved once through the fur beneath Moss's collar. "You kept it at the cemetery quiet," she said. But for those 2 days, you made my life too quiet. Walter lowered his head. He did not ask her to forgive him. He placed the rose on the far end of the bench and left by the same path he had entered. The following morning, he found Bennett at the memorial of the unreturned. Bennett was replacing a corroded screw beneath a bronze panel when Walter stopped beside the cart. I protected my control and called it order, Walter said. Bennett set the screwdriver down. Walter's uniform shirt was buttoned neatly, and his keys hung at his belt as they always had. His hand did not touch them. I was wrong, he continued. About the report, about you, about the dog. Bennett looked toward Moss, who lay in the shade beside the maintenance cart. You owe Miriam more than you owe me. I spoke to her. Walter took a white rose from behind his back and crouched far enough away that Moss could choose the distance between them. He placed the flower on the ground without reaching for the dog. Moss stood, smelled Walter's open hand, then looked back at Bennett. Nothing larger happened. Walter began arriving at the eastern gate before Moss on Bennett's days away. He checked that burial services had ended, placed the flower beyond the fence, and stepped aside. Dana noticed. She arranged a meeting in the cemetery office with Bennett, Walter, Miriam, and the owner of the flower shop. Miriam agreed to attend only after Dana explained why the story would not be shared publicly without her approval. Together they created a small wooden container near the service gate. A local carpenter donated the box, and Dana ordered a simple brass plate, the white rose box. Fresh flowers from arrangements scheduled for removal could be placed there with the family's permission. The flower shop offered unsold white roses that were still in good condition, and visiting families could donate a separate bloom if they chose. Moss no longer approached the graves. Bennett stocked the box on his work days. Walter handled the other afternoons. With Miriam's consent, Dana wrote a short post for Prairie Haven's community page. She did not present Moss as a spectacle or invite visitors to follow him. She wrote about Gold Star families whose loneliness continued long after ceremonies ended, the importance of asking older adults what support they wanted, and the responsibility involved in approaching or adopting an unknown animal. She also wrote that preserving dignity sometimes required more context than a rule book could hold. Smile cards began appearing inside the box. Most carried only a first name or a few handwritten words. Families were not asking Moss to deliver messages to the dead. They were contributing a flower to the ritual that still brought Miriam out of her house each afternoon. One cold morning, Bennett arrived before the maintenance crew. Frost had formed along the shaded edges of the memorial of the unreturned. He prepared his cloths, mixed the approved solution, and worked from the first bronze panel toward the center of the wall. This time he did not pass Elliot Crane's name. Bennett cleaned the narrow spaces around each letter and removed the pale mineral line beneath the lower edge. He replaced one darkened screw, wiped the panel dry, and waited until the bronze reflected the thin morning light evenly. From his shirt pocket, he removed the team coin he had carried for 10 years. He placed it beneath Elliot's name. There was no final conversation and no claim that the work had repaired what happened overseas. Bennett packed away the cloth and moved to the next panel. It was simply a task he had postponed long enough. Near the end of the afternoon, Walter placed a white rose in the box beside the eastern gate. Moss approached, lifted it carefully, and started toward the park. Dana locked the administration office. Walter watched the shepherd leave without checking the time or opening the guard ledger. Bennett remained near the restored bronze wall, the team coin resting beneath Elliot's name. At the third bench, Miriam heard the familiar uneven rhythm drawing closer along the brick path. Music from Edwin's radio traveled through the open window of the blue-gated house and followed her beneath the trees. Moss placed the flower into her hand. This time, every petal was intact. Long after the larger moments fade, I think the smallest details are what remain: Walter's silent keys, Edwin's cup still hanging above the stove, and Miriam leaving home each afternoon because familiar footsteps might meet her at the third bench. The story reminds me that honoring someone does not end at a grave or beneath a polished name. Sometimes it continues through the widow who still sets out 2 cups, the aging neighbor whose house has grown too quiet, or the animal that keeps returning to a path shaped by love. Rules can protect people, but when pride hides inside them, they may wound the very lives they were meant to serve. Bennett, Miriam, Walter, and Moss belong to a fictional story. The experiences beneath it, grief carried through ordinary routines, regret followed by better choices, and kindness offered without knowing where it may lead, are deeply real. Perhaps you still keep a tradition for someone you miss. Perhaps an animal once stayed near when words could not help, or someone in your community has been waiting longer than anyone realizes. You are welcome to share that memory, thought, or prayer in the comments. May God bless those living with an empty chair. Guide us toward the people who need noticing, and give us grace to choose compassion. Please like and subscribe if these grounded human stories matter to you. Tonight, somewhere, an old radio may still be playing while someone listens for footsteps coming closer.